Pentagon official recently said the U.S. military believes cluster munitions would be useful for Ukraine in pushing back against Russian forces. Kyiv has been asking Washington for U.S.-made cluster munitions since last summer. However, the Biden administration has held back, perhaps fearing political blowback at home and in parts of Europe. Let's take a look at cluster munitions and Kyiv's demands. The U.S. has not approved cluster munitions for Kyiv yet because of congressional restrictions and concerns from allies. Cluster munitions normally release large numbers of smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a wide area. Kyiv has urged members of Congress to press Biden administration to approve sending dual-purpose conventional improved munitions, commonly known as DPICM. It is a type of warhead that releases smaller explosive submunitions, increasing lethality. Experts say cluster munitions would be useful in countering the infantry-heavy assault units Russia has used to gain ground in Ukraine. Opponents warn that when bomblets scatter, they can maim and kill civilians and have high failure rates. Cluster munitions are controversial as some submunitions typically fail to detonate, leaving behind unexploded ordnance that can harm civilians or friendly forces. A 2008 pact prohibiting production, use, and stockpiling of cluster munitions has been adopted by over 120 countries, including most NATO members. The United States, Russia, and Ukraine have declined to join. Meanwhile, a Human Rights Watch report has flagged the use of cluster munitions by both Ukraine and Russia. The international advocacy group called on both Moscow and Kyiv to stop using the weapons and urged Washington not to supply them. As per the group, Ukraine fired cluster munition rockets into Russian-controlled areas in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Izium last year. The group has previously reported that Russia's use of cluster munitions in Ukraine has killed scores of civilians. Okay, for more on this, we are being joined by Peter Kuznick from Washington, D.C. He is the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Peter, welcome back to WION, and great to have you. You know, every few days we hear, and it's becoming daily, that there are new weapons of war needed for the war in Russia and Ukraine. How concerning is now talk of cluster munitions, considering the fact that some believe that Russia and Ukraine have already been using them, but when the United States would want to provide them, are we entering a new territory of the war that we haven't seen?
We've seen a steady pattern, a very disturbing pattern, of the United States saying it's not going to send new weapon systems, saying this sometimes for months or over a year, and then the Biden administration caving to pressure and sending those weapon systems. So this is a very disturbing development. We've agreed to give them almost every weapon system they've asked for. The F-16 fighter jets have not yet been delivered, but we've approved them, we've approved training of them, and we've still held out sending the Army missiles, the ATACMS, but this would be another escalation. And you have to understand in the context of what's going on. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is doing very poorly by all measures. And many of us understood that if the counteroffensive did not succeed and wrest back much of that territory that Russia had taken, that Ukraine would be under enormous pressure to have a ceasefire and diplomacy. The United States has been resisting that. The upcoming NATO meeting in Vilnius will be another attempt by the Biden administration and their close allies like the Brits to put pressure on the rest of Europe to keep providing weapons, arms, money to Ukraine. But the world pressure is going the other direction. We see pressure from China, from Brazil, from the Africans, from the Vatican, from the UN, and many others for diplomacy and negotiations. So this is another attempt to forestall that pressure to negotiate by putting new weapon systems into Ukraine. And they're not going to make a significant difference. They're not going to be a game changer. They're not going to turn the tide of the war, but they will kill more people. And the thing about cluster munitions, Somebody said, and it's true, this means that the last Ukrainian to die from this war has not yet been born. In Vietnam, the U.S. troops pulled out 50 years ago. People are still dying in Vietnam from the U.S. cluster munitions and other kinds of weapons that the U.S. detonated there. The same thing is going to happen in Ukraine. It would be tragic. It would be criminal. It would outrage the morality of much of the world, including many of our NATO allies, including Germany, Spain, and others.
Wow. Peter, you are the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Are we close to nuclear conflict at this point with Russia? Is something like that escalating?
Fortunately, we're not close. Russia has not shown, despite Putin's aggressive rhetoric, Russia has not shown any signs that it has or intends to mobilize its nuclear forces. But the Ukrainian position is still that it will drive every Russian troop out of all Ukrainian soil.
Okay.
Biden has suggested that if that succeeded, that would pose an existential threat to Russia, in which case Russia would use nuclear weapons. So, which is why so much of the world says, let's have a ceasefire, let's sit down and negotiate. The problem is that both Ukraine and Russia are making maximalist demands, and there seems to be little room for compromise. Russia now controls more than 20% of Ukrainian territory. At the start of the war, or at least the recent start of the war, on February 24th, 2022, Russia controlled 7%. Now it's over 20%. Ukraine wants to get all of that back. It's not going to happen. But there has to be some line of compromise in which there'll be a demilitarized zone. There'll be a ceasefire. There'll be security guarantees. But we can't let this killing, this bloodshed, these provocations, this threat of escalation continue.
Peter Kuznick, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.